As German armor sliced into Poland on September 1st, 1939, a man entered Washington's War Department. He was 58, a brigadier general, yet chose civilian clothes, a white suit, to underscore his detachment from the unfolding conflict. Hours earlier, at 3:50 a.m., news of the invasion had reached him. By 10:30 that same morning, inside Secretary Harry Woodring's office, the oath was administered. He became Chief of Staff of the United States Army, now holding the rank of general. Already, Warsaw was enduring bombardment. This moment marked the official start of a burden that would transform everything. The forces he now commanded represented a profound vulnerability. Barely 190,000 individuals served, placing the nation's military power 19th globally, behind countries like Portugal, Switzerland, and Belgium. This numerical deficit created an immediate, critical strategic exposure. Germany, by contrast, had just unleashed over 1.5 million troops on Poland. The entire American contingent would have been swallowed by a single German army group with considerable ease. Equipment problems compounded the issue. Much of it predated the prior global conflict. Tanks were so scarce, soldiers practiced maneuvers with trucks marked to simulate them. The total count was fewer than 500, mostly light models, entirely inadequate against German panzers. Artillery pieces were relics from 1918. Rifles remained the Springfield models, identical to those carried by doughboys into French trenches 2 decades prior. The 9 infantry divisions listed on paper were largely hollow formations. Only 3 approached full strength, while the others averaged just 3,000 men each, a fraction of the 15,000 required for combat readiness. The 4 armies managing the continental United States existed with skeleton staffs of only 4,400 troops apiece. No American division possessed complete operational readiness. However, the new Chief of Staff recognized that this crisis extended beyond mere material or manpower shortages. A deeper systemic flaw lay in leadership itself. Those designated to command American forces in an impending conflict were often too old, too entrenched in their habits, and too comfortable to effectively guide modern combat operations. He observed among his general officers what he would later characterize as significant arterial sclerosis. The average age for generals was alarmingly high. Many had occupied their current posts for years, overseeing identical small commands, attending the same social engagements, and fighting the same bureaucratic skirmishes they had known for decades. He understood that sentiment or tradition could not impede national survival. Within 2 years, this imperative would compel him to remove approximately 600 officers from the service. This process would terminate careers, damage relationships, and create political adversaries in Congress. Critics would accuse him of stripping the Army of its intellectual capital. Yet, this painful disruption would forge the generation of commanders who ultimately secured victory in the Second World War. The core challenge confronting him had been festering for 2 decades. The peacetime Army's promotion mechanism functioned almost entirely on seniority. Advancement was impossible until someone above retired or died. Below a brigadier general, virtually no other path existed. Merit held little sway. Initiative was frequently penalized. The safest professional approach involved avoiding mistakes, cultivating superior relationships, and patiently waiting. This produced a bottleneck, which planners call the hump. Approximately 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire regular Army officer corps, were clustered within an extraordinarily narrow age band. These men had joined during the First World War, received rapid wartime promotions, then saw their careers stall for the next 20 years. The numbers painted a stark picture. Over 1,800 captains were in their 40s. More than 1,000 officers, whose age and experience suited them for lieutenant colonel, remained captains in 1940. There were even 234 lieutenants in their 40s, men who had spent over 2 decades at the lowest commission rank. This issue only worsened. Talented young officers, observing their seniors, saw no future. Many of the most capable departed for civilian careers where ability was rewarded. Those who stayed often grew cynical, merely performing their duties while awaiting retirement. The peacetime army failed to attract or retain the talent vital for wartime. He understood this problem intimately. He had served as a colonel during the First World War, as chief of operations for the 1st Infantry Division, then as chief of staff for the 8th Corps in the 1st Army. His performance had been exceptional. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, considered him one of the most proficient officers. But after the armistice, he was reduced to captain. Wartime promotions had vanished. He served another 15 years before regaining the rank of colonel. The very system that nearly derailed his own path was now his responsibility to overhaul. The generals leading the army in 1939 were products of this flawed system. Most had attained their positions through patience, not performance. They had awaited their turn, avoided controversy, and outlasted rivals. The very qualities that brought them success in peacetime, caution, deference to superiors, mastery of bureaucratic process, were precisely those that would lead to casualties in war. He had observed these officers for years, familiar with their strengths and shortcomings. He knew which could adapt and which could not, which would rise to a crisis and which would buckle under pressure. The insights gathered over 3 decades of service would now dictate who would command American forces in battle. Appearing before Congress in April 1940, he articulated his philosophy with characteristic directness. Field leadership, he stated, depends to an important extent on one's legs and stomach and nervous system. It depends on one's ability to withstand hardships and lack of sleep, and still be disposed energetically and aggressively to command men, to dominate men on the battlefield. The generals he inherited, he believed, could not meet this demanding standard. Most of them were too old to command troops in battle under the terrific pressure of modern war, he wrote, concluding that their minds were set in outmoded patterns and they could not change to meet the new conditions. This was not abstract speculation. He had meticulously studied the German campaigns in Poland and France, observing how speed, aggression, and initiative across all command levels had shattered larger forces relying on methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new paradigm of warfare. Their commanders made decisions in hours, a process that would have consumed days for traditional armies. They exploited every breakthrough relentlessly, driving deep into enemy territory before defenders could react. Commanders tasked with leading American soldiers against such an adversary required a fundamentally different approach. They needed to move swiftly, decide quickly, and accept calculated risks. Physical endurance was paramount, demanding presence at the front, not from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. They required the moral fortitude to make agonizing decisions when lives hung in the balance. Removing senior officers, however, was far from straightforward. The Army's traditions spanned back to the Revolution. Officers maintained congressional connections, industry ties, and classmates distributed throughout the service. Ending careers that spanned decades would not be without repercussions. The political stakes were immense. Every general he sidelined had former subordinates who would remember the perceived slight. Each forced retirement generated adversaries who might undermine him later. The wives of senior officers formed a potent social network in Washington, capable of either building or destroying reputations. He was not merely restructuring the Army. He was dismantling an entire way of life. Yet he proceeded. He had faced resistance before. Early in his career, he had openly disagreed with General Pershing in a meeting, expecting disciplinary action. Instead, Pershing had promoted him. He learned that honest counsel, delivered respectfully but firmly, commanded more respect than sycophancy. He applied this lesson now. Initially, he acted informally, using his authority as chief of staff to reassign officers to less critical roles, bypass them for promotion, or encourage early retirement. When these measures proved insufficient, he pursued legislative authority to directly remove officers. The mechanism he established became popularly known as the plucking board, though its official designation was the removal board. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 granted him the necessary power by eliminating the requirement that promotions below brigadier general occur solely through seniority. This enabled him to elevate younger officers over their seniors and sideline those unable to meet the demands of modern command. The board itself comprised 6 retired general officers, a deliberate choice to prevent serving officers from judging potential rivals. He requested his immediate predecessor as Chief of Staff, General Malin Craig, to emerge from retirement and chair the board. Craig, who had served from 1935 to 1939, enjoyed widespread respect throughout the Army. His involvement lent legitimacy to the process. No one could accuse him of personal vendettas when his own predecessor was making the final determinations. His instructions to the board established the guiding principle. The mission, he wrote, is not to weigh a long and successful career against a failure in 1940 or 1941. It is not the function of the board to determine how good a man he has been. Rather, it is to determine the worth and value of the individual to the Army today. Critical times are upon us. The measure must be today's performance. Officers removed by the board were granted 1 year to retire, a more dignified exit than immediate dismissal, but an unmistakable end to their careers. The board's authority was sweeping. It could remove any officer from line promotion for reasons deemed good and sufficient. Documented removals reveal part of the story. In the summer and fall of 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and Reserve officers. Lieutenant colonels constituted the largest group, representing the bottleneck of First World War veterans who had spent decades awaiting advancement. In the 5 years preceding his command, only 37 officers total had been removed from the Army, averaging fewer than 8 per year. He increased the removal rate more than 5-fold. Ultimately, 500 colonels were forced into retirement. He estimated he pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States formally entered the war. The scale of this reorganization became dramatically evident during the Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941. These massive exercises, involving nearly 500,000 troops across vast stretches of Louisiana and East Texas, served as his ultimate examination for his officer corps. They were the largest military exercises in American history up to that point. They tested not just tactical proficiency, but leadership under simulated combat conditions. Units moved day and night. Communications broke down. Plans dissolved, requiring immediate improvisation. A reasonable approximation of the fog of war enveloped commanders who had spent decades in the predictable routines of peacetime service. He observed meticulously, noting which commanders could manage stress, adapt to changing circumstances, and lead men under combat-like pressure. He moved constantly between command posts, scrutinizing how generals reacted to setbacks, communicated with their staffs, and sustained the morale of exhausted troops. Of the 42 generals commanding a division, corps, or army during these exercises, historians estimate only 11 would go on to hold combat commands during the actual war. The other 31 were sidelined, reassigned, or retired. He had witnessed what he needed to understand. One incident during the maneuvers gained legendary status. A forceful armored division commander, tasked with being contained by a defensive line, instead led his tanks on a night march around the enemy flank, moving so rapidly that umpires struggled to keep pace. At dawn, his tanks stormed the headquarters of a lieutenant general, effectively capturing the opposing force's commander. This audacious move, executed by an officer named George Patton, then leading the 2nd Armored Division, was brilliant, aggressive, and precisely the kind of initiative he sought. Patton had proven he could outmaneuver and outthink his adversaries. The lieutenant general, Hugh Drum, had demonstrated an inability to adapt to unexpected shifts. Both lessons critically informed his decisions on who would lead in actual combat. The men he removed were not incompetent. Many had served honorably for decades. Some possessed distinguished records from the First World War. But he applied a ruthless standard. Past achievements meant nothing if an officer could not perform effectively in the present. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's peak years were behind him. A direct confrontation illustrated his method. A general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to revise the Army's training manuals to integrate lessons from the German campaigns in Europe. He proposed 18 months for the task. The Chief of Staff offered 3. The general refused. The offer was extended to 4 months. The general insisted it was impossible, that such comprehensive revisions could not be completed in under a year and a half. He urged reconsideration, issuing a quiet warning. Be very careful about that answer. When the general maintained the timeline could not be shortened, the response was immediate. I'm sorry. Then you are relieved. The incident revealed a fundamental aspect of his leadership. He did not raise his voice, nor did he issue threats. He simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. Officers unable to meet his standards were removed, regardless of their prior service or influence. The manuals, incidentally, were completed in 4 months by other officers. He extended the same cold practicality to personal friends. One general, assigned an urgent mission to France, explained his inability to depart swiftly, citing his wife's absence and unpacked household furniture. The Chief of Staff personally confirmed this was his position. When the general affirmed it, the reply was terse. Well, my God, man, we are at war, and you are a general. I am sorry, too, but you will be retired tomorrow. The most prominent casualty of these reforms, though through being bypassed rather than formally removed, was Lieutenant General Hugh Drum. He had attained Major General rank in 1930 and held nearly every senior position below Chief of Staff. He had even served as Chief of Staff of the First Army in France during the First World War, with Douglas MacArthur claiming he had virtually run the army. By every measure of seniority and experience, Drum should have become Chief of Staff. However, Drum had promoted his own candidacy so aggressively that he alienated President Franklin Roosevelt. He openly lobbied for the role, courted newspaper coverage, and made his expectation clear. When the appointment was made in 1939, Roosevelt bypassed Drum and 32 other senior officers, selecting the man who was 34th in overall Army seniority. He had been outranked by 21 major generals and 11 brigadier generals. Drum never forgave the slight and relentlessly pursued high command. During the war, he was summoned to Washington, anticipating command of American forces in Europe based on a 1939 conversation with Roosevelt. Instead, he was offered the position of Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek in China. Drum strenuously objected, describing the mission as nebulous, uncertain, and indefinite. He complained about serving 3 masters, Chiang, the British, and Washington. When informed no large American forces would deploy to China, Drum declared he would be wasted in a minor post. The Chief of Staff concluded Drum lacked enthusiasm and recommended against his appointment. Joseph Stilwell was selected instead on January 14, 1942. When Stilwell was asked if he would accept the difficult China command, his response was simple: I will go where I am sent. Drum was relegated to leading the Eastern Defense Command, essentially home defense on the American East Coast. He reached mandatory retirement age at 64 in September 1943. He received his second Distinguished Service Medal at a ceremony where the Chief of Staff himself read the citation, but he never received the combat command he had pursued for decades. The irony persists. Fort Drum in New York bears his name. No military installation is named for the man who oversaw his career. The removals created space for the officers the Chief of Staff believed could secure victory. But identifying these individuals demanded a different kind of insight, the capacity to recognize and proven potential, to see what men might become rather than what they had already accomplished. A legend formed around his methods. People claimed he maintained a little black book containing the names of promising officers he had observed throughout his career. The story was so frequently repeated it became accepted as fact. His own biographer, Forrest Pogue, mentioned it on page 95 of his second volume. However, the little black book never existed. The George C. Marshall Foundation confirmed no such notebook was ever found among his papers. When Dr. Larry Bland, editor of his collected papers, directly questioned Pogue twice about such a book, Pogue confirmed it did not exist. Pogue admitted repeating the myth, regretting its inclusion in his writing because it lent an undeserved authority to the story. What he actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his career, he had observed officers from key vantage points. At Fort Benning, where he served as assistant commandant from 1927 to 1932, he witnessed hundreds of officers teach, learn, and lead. In China, in Washington, and in various staff positions, he noted who demonstrated initiative and who awaited orders, who thought clearly under pressure and who faltered, who inspired men and who merely commanded them. The roster of promising officers existed entirely within his mind. He could recall conversations from years past, fleeting impressions, potential glimpsed during a single exercise or staff meeting. This mental catalog, accumulated over decades, would determine who led American forces into battle. During his years at Fort Benning, approximately 150 future generals attended the infantry school, with about 50 serving on the faculty. He observed them all, assigning challenging problems and studying their responses. He noted who asked the pertinent questions and who settled for easy answers. These officers became known as the Marshall Men. Their careers dramatically accelerated once he gained the power to promote them. The selection of Dwight Eisenhower exemplified his methods. Their first significant contact occurred in 1930, when he was impressed by a young major on the American Battlefield Monuments Commission staff who assisted General John Pershing in revising his memoirs. The work demanded tact, intelligence, and the ability to manage a challenging superior. He noted these qualities and remembered the young officer's name. He later offered Eisenhower a position on the Fort Benning faculty. Eisenhower politely declined, having already received orders for a coveted general staff assignment in Washington. The refusal did not offend him. If anything, it demonstrated Eisenhower's capacity for decisive action. Their paths converged again at the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Eisenhower, then a lieutenant colonel, served as chief of staff for Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army. His performance captured his attention. Eisenhower had helped plan operations that consistently outmaneuvered the opposing force. His staff work was meticulous yet flexible. When plans required alteration, he adapted them. The pivotal moment arrived on December 14, 1941, precisely 1 week after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. He summoned Eisenhower to Washington. Eisenhower flew from Fort Sam Houston in Texas, arriving exhausted after delays and adverse weather. It was the first time he had conversed with his superior for more than 2 minutes. The chief of staff presented a grim overview of the Pacific situation. The Philippines, where Eisenhower had served 4 years under MacArthur, were under attack. The Pacific Fleet lay devastated at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia. The strategic outlook appeared desperate. Then, the chief of staff posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower requested a few hours and a desk. Both were provided. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum acknowledging the Philippines could not be entirely saved, but arguing they could not be abandoned either. The United States, he asserted, had to exert every effort to support the defenders, even if ultimately futile, because abandonment would erode American credibility among allies throughout the Pacific. He recommended establishing Australia as a primary base for Pacific operations. This analysis became the cornerstone of Pacific strategy. More importantly, it demonstrated precisely what the Chief of Staff sought. Eisenhower had not requested further information. He had not convened a committee to study the problem. He had not hedged his conclusions with caveats. He analyzed the situation, made a decision, and presented a clear recommendation. The Chief of Staff's response revealed his core philosophy. Eisenhower, he stated, the department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but feel always compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Eisenhower had passed the crucial examination. He assigned him to the War Plans Division overseeing the Philippines and Far East. By February 1942, just 2 months later, Eisenhower was chief of the entire War Plans Division. His subsequent ascent was the swiftest of any general in the Second World War. From lieutenant colonel in December 1941, he attained five-star General of the Army by December 1944, a promotion that occurred merely 4 days after the Chief of Staff himself received his fifth star. George Patton presented a different management challenge. He had known Patton since the First World War and rekindled the acquaintance at Fort Myer in late 1938 when Patton commanded the 3rd Cavalry. The two men were a study in contrasts. One reserved, methodical, self-effacing, the other flamboyant, impulsive, and convinced of his own destiny. He considered Patton the Allies' most effective fighting general, but recognized he required careful handling. Patton, he observed, needs a break to slow him down because he is apt to coast at breakneck speed, propelled by his enthusiasm and exuberance. The general's wife, Catherine, once told Patton, "George, you say these outrageous things, and then you look at me to see if I am going to smile." A general cannot talk in any such wild way. At 54, Patton fell within the age range that might have been sidelined under the age standards. He survived the plucking board's review only because he exhibited the energy and drive of a much younger man. His performance in the Louisiana maneuvers, where his armored division circled the opposition, proved his age had not diminished his capabilities. The Chief of Staff elevated Patton from colonel in July 1938 to 4-star general by April 1945. The path between these ranks was tumultuous. Patton's outspokenness frequently caused trouble. His actions sometimes bordered on insubordination. But he protected him. Understanding Patton was irreplaceable. Twice during the war, he intervened to save Patton's career. In Sicily, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, an incident that became a scandal when reported. Eisenhower, commanding the Mediterranean theater, considered sending Patton home in disgrace. The Chief of Staff advised patience. Patton was too valuable to lose. After the Knutsford affair in England, when Patton made impolitic remarks suggesting a post-war world dominated by the United States and Britain, omitting the Soviet Union, the Chief of Staff again shielded him. The incident nearly cost Patton his command on the eve of the Normandy invasion. His intervention kept him in place. Omar Bradley represented yet another route to high command. He had served as a tactics instructor at Fort Benning during the Chief of Staff's tenure as assistant commandant. The two men had worked closely, and the Chief of Staff had observed Bradley's teaching methods, his interaction with students, and his approach to military problems. He described Bradley as quiet, unassuming, capable, with sound common sense. These were not flashy attributes, but they were the ones he valued most. Bradley did not seek attention, nor did he self-promote. He simply performed his duties with consistent competence. Bradley later wrote that no individual had a greater personal or professional influence on him than George Marshall. This relationship shaped Bradley's entire career and his command philosophy. Bradley ascended from brigadier general in February 1941 to 4-star general and commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. More than 1.3 million soldiers served under him during the campaigns in France and Germany. He would later become the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, placing him at the pinnacle of the American military establishment. Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe for his sharp tongue and acerbic personality, impressed the Chief of Staff so profoundly that he held open the position of Chief of the Tactical Section at Fort Benning for a full year, until Stilwell became available. Other officers desired the job. He waited for the man he wanted. He called Stilwell possessed of a genius for instruction and one of the exceptionally brilliant and cultured men of the Army. The description of Stilwell as cultured might have surprised those familiar only with his crusty exterior, but Stilwell spoke fluent Chinese, had studied Chinese history and literature, and understood Asia better than almost any American officer of his generation. When he required someone for the impossible China assignment that Drum had rejected, Stilwell was his choice. The mission proved every bit as challenging as Drum had feared. Stilwell quarreled with Chiang Kai-shek, clashed with the British, and watched his forces suffer repeated defeats. But he never surrendered. He never requested relief. He did precisely what he had been asked to do. The roster of commanders he identified and promoted reads like a history of American triumph in the Second World War. Mark Clark led the Fifth Army in Italy. Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army in Europe. Jacob Devers led the Sixth Army Group in the invasion of southern France. J. Lawton Collins became one of the most aggressive corps commanders in the European theater. Lucian Truscott led divisions and corps across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Matthew Ridgway commanded airborne forces in Normandy and later led the 18th Airborne Corps. Walter Kruger directed the 6th Army across the Pacific. These men guided American forces from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of Germany, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Philippines and beyond. They simultaneously overcame two of the most formidable military powers in history. The ramifications of his reforms became evident when American forces were measured against armies that had not undergone similar transformations. France offered the most devastating contrast. When Germany attacked in May 1940, the French army possessed more tanks than the Wehrmacht. It had adequate manpower with approximately 5 million men under arms. Its defensive fortifications along the Maginot Line were engineering marvels, representing the most sophisticated military construction of the era. On paper, France should have resisted the German onslaught. Yet, French leadership was aged, inflexible, and trapped in the patterns of the previous war. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was 67 years old during the campaign. He established his headquarters in a medieval fortress, the Château de Vincennes, lacking modern communication equipment. The headquarters had no radio. Orders traveled by motorcycle courier, a method suited for 1914, not 1940. Gamelin had decreed in 1935 that the High Command was the sole arbiter of doctrine. All articles, lectures, and books by serving officers required approval before publication. This effectively stifled innovation, ensuring French military thinking remained frozen in the First World War. Officers who questioned established doctrine risked their careers. When the Germans breached the Ardennes forest, an area Gamelin had left defended by only 10 reserve divisions, considering it impassable for armor, the French command structure collapsed. Gamelin remained in what observers called tragic immobility, unable to issue decisive orders as his armies disintegrated. The speed of the German advance overwhelmed the command system designed for the deliberate pace of trench warfare. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, was 73, even older than Gamelin. Weygand arrived on May 19th, 9 days after the German attack began, when the breakthrough was already complete. Within a week, he displayed a pessimism that bordered on defeatism. The battle was lost before he could exert influence. France fell in 6 weeks. Approximately 60,000 French soldiers died between May and June of 1940. The cause was not a lack of courage among the troops or equipment shortages. French soldiers fought bravely in many engagements, and French tanks often surpassed their German counterparts. The cause was leadership incapable of adapting to the speed and brutality of modern warfare. Britain fared only marginally better in the war's early years. The British Officer Corps maintained a rigid, class-based selection system where 89% of officer candidates at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1939 originated from expensive private schools. This system produced capable administrators but discouraged the aggressive initiative demanded by modern conflict. British reforms only followed battlefield defeats that forced change. The General Service Corps scheme, designed to broaden officer recruitment, was not introduced until July 1942, nearly 3 years into the war. By then, Britain had endured disasters in France, North Africa, and the Far East. Germany, ironically, possessed a more merit-based officer evaluation system than either France or Britain. German officers were assessed across 7 categories, from suitable for Wehrmacht high command to already unsuitable for current position. Junior officers could command battle groups over their seniors based on tactical necessity. This flexibility coupled with a doctrine emphasizing initiative at all levels, granted the German army decisive advantages in the early years of the war. However, German flexibility had its limitations. Adolf Hitler increasingly interfered with military operations, overriding his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders who disagreed with the Führer risked their careers and sometimes their lives. Honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that pleased Hitler. His critics charged that he was destroying institutional memory, discarding decades of accumulated experience, and promoting unproven men over established leaders. Service newspapers accused him of getting rid of all the brains of the army. His response was typically understated. "I could not reply," he said, "that I was eliminating considerable arterial sclerosis." Congressional opposition focused on National Guard generals with political connections. The Guard was deeply intertwined with state politics. Guard generals often owed their positions to governors and legislators, not military merit. When politicians questioned his efforts to replace Guard division leadership, his response was blunt. "I'm not going to leave him in command of that division," he declared of one politically connected general. "So, I will put it to you this way. If he stays, I go, and if I stay, he goes." The politician retreated. His willingness to stake his own position on personnel decisions gave him leverage few chiefs of staff had ever possessed. When Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter relayed criticism from a friend in the Army Reserve, his tart reply was, "Most of our senior officers on such duty are deadwood and should be eliminated from the service as rapidly as possible." He did not temper his views for allies of the powerful. Opposition never halted him because he possessed something his critics lacked: the absolute confidence of President Roosevelt. The president had selected him over 33 more senior officers precisely because he recognized in him the moral courage to make difficult decisions. Roosevelt consistently supported his chief of staff, even when political costs were substantial. His selections were not infallible. He made errors and learned from them. He was particularly fond of an officer named Lloyd Fredendall, calling him one of the best and noting, "You could see determination all over his face." Fredendall commanded the largest task force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, in November 1942. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Fredendall proved disastrous. His command post was located 70 miles behind the front lines. In an elaborate underground bunker his engineers had spent weeks constructing while combat units needed their skills elsewhere. He issued confusing orders, using a personal code his subordinates could not decipher. When German forces attacked, American units were poorly positioned and worse coordinated. The result was the worst American defeat of a European war. Over 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. German commanders, who had questioned American troops' fighting ability, concluded their doubts were confirmed. Both the Chief of Staff and Eisenhower came to regret the Fredendall selection. But the system he had created allowed for correction. Fredendall was relieved and replaced by Patton, who within weeks transformed the defeated corps into a fighting force. The ability to remove failing commanders without destroying their careers or provoking political crises was itself a product of his reforms. Fredendall was not disgraced. He was sent back to the United States to train new troops, a role where his organizational skills proved useful without the pressures of combat command. His experience, even failed experience, was not wasted. During the war, 16 Army Division commanders were relieved for cause, along with at least 5 Corps commanders. Crucially, the system permitted second chances. At least 5 generals relieved of combat command were later given another division to lead. Orlando Ward commanded the 20th Armored Division in 1945 after an earlier relief. Terry Allen led the 104th Infantry Division through the war's end after his removal from the 1st Infantry Division. This flexibility distinguished the American approach from both German and British systems. German commanders who failed were often executed or imprisoned. British commanders who failed rarely received second opportunities. The American system treated failure as information, not disgrace, allowing the army to learn from mistakes rather than merely punish them. The transformation he achieved can be measured numerically. When he assumed command in September 1939, the army numbered fewer than 190,000 soldiers, organized into 6 divisions, only 4 in the continental United States, 1 in Hawaii, and 1 in the Philippines. By the close of 1940, the number had grown to 269,000. By the end of 1941, it exceeded 1.4 million. By 1943, nearly 7 million. At its peak in March 1945, the United States Army comprised over 8 million soldiers, organized into 91 divisions. This expansion necessitated a corresponding increase in officers. Men who were lieutenants in 1940 were colonels by 1944. The bottleneck that had stifled careers for 2 decades was shattered by the relentless demands of global conflict. The young officers he had identified and protected now led divisions and corps into battle. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force he had inherited 5 years earlier. American soldiers crossed the English Channel in landing craft designed and built in American shipyards. They were supported by aircraft manufactured in American factories. They carried weapons produced by an industrial mobilization that had fundamentally reshaped the American economy. Yet, equipment alone did not secure victories. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, and tested by the system he devised. They had survived the plucking board. They had proven themselves in maneuvers and in combat. They were the finest officers the American military could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called him the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared that our army and people have never been so indebted to any soldier. Harry Truman simply stated that millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. George C. Marshall gave it victory. Time magazine named him Man of the Year twice, in 1943 and 1947. He became the first and only career soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded in 1953 for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the war. He served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only individual in American history to hold both positions. The officers he removed faded into obscurity. Their names do not appear in war histories. Their potential contributions, whatever they might have been, remained unmade. Some accepted their fate with dignity, understanding the mission superseded any individual career. Others harbored resentment for the remainder of their lives, never accepting that their time had passed. The officers he promoted became legends. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States. Bradley became a 5-star general and the most respected military figure of the post-war era. Patton died in a car accident just months after the German surrender, his name forever linked with aggressive leadership. The Marshall Men shaped American military doctrine and defense policy for a generation after the war concluded. He himself sought no personal glory. When Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman became president, many assumed he would receive command of the invasion of Japan or some other prestigious assignment. Instead, he remained in Washington, coordinating the global war effort from his desk. When Eisenhower was chosen to lead the Normandy invasion, a position he had desired, he accepted the decision without complaint. Truman offered him the chance to become the military governor of Germany after the war. He declined. He had witnessed enough conflict. He wanted to return to his garden in Leesburg, Virginia, and spend time with his wife, Catherine. But true retirement remained elusive. Truman needed him in China as a special envoy, then as Secretary of State, then as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. He served until his health failed, always answering when his country called. His garden waited.